Good morning, distinguished guests, colleagues, students, friends, and members of the extended School of International Studies family. It's both an honor and a deep privilege as Dean of the School of International Studies to welcome you to this special lecture. This morning, we do more than gather here. We come together to pay tribute to a towering figure, Professor Bimal Prasad, whose scholarship, public service, and values embody the very ideals on which the School of International Studies was built. Our gathering is made all the more special because it comes in the 70th year of SIS, founded in 1955 as the Indian School of International Studies, and later in 1969 integrated into SIS, into JNU. SIS has grown into the country's and Asia's premier center for the study of international affairs, foreign policy, and area studies. It has shaped and been shaped by generations of scholars, diplomats, institution builders, and public intellectuals, including some who are present here. And among them, Professor Bimal Prasad stands tall. His own life mirrors the story of modern India, a journey from modest beginnings to the highest echelons of scholarship and public service. Born in 1924 at Kudra, a village in Bihar's Kaimur district, the son of a peasant farmer, Professor Prasad rose from the modest setting of a village school to complete his BA and MA in history from Patna University. As a young man, he came in close contact with Jayaprakash Narayan, JP, and the socialist movement, joining the student activism of the national freedom struggle. This engagement with JP and the ideals of socialism and democracy remained central to his intellectual and moral compass throughout his life. After teaching history at Patna University, he won a Fulbright fellowship to Columbia, where he completed his PhD. His doctoral thesis was published in 1962 as The Origins of Indian Foreign Policy, the Indian National Congress and World Affairs, 1885 to 1947. It remains, for many of us, a classic. A work of deep archival research and clear clinical analytical wisdom, tracing the consistent long-term trends in India's foreign policy from its nationalist roots. In 1964, he joined the Indian School of International Studies, which, as I said, after its merger in JNU became SIS. As professor of South Asian Studies and later as dean, he strengthened the interdisciplinary ethos of the center and the school and championed a multidisciplinary methodological approach. His scholarly contributions range from South Asian regional politics to JP's role in Indian democracy, culminating in his authoritative three-volume study on the history of the socialist movement. But his intellectual life was never confined to the academy. In the aftermath of Nepal's democratic revolution, he was appointed India's ambassador to Nepal. For 4 years in Kathmandu, he brought the same humane sensibility to diplomacy that marked his scholarship. He worked to foster a harmonious India-Nepal relationship, smoothing the frictions of a young democracy's assertion of sovereignty with the fraternal traditions behind the two countries. After returning from Kathmandu, Professor Prasad turned to what he considered a labor of love, editing the 10-volume selected works of Jayaprakash Narayan for the then Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, now the Prime Minister's Museum and Library. This monumental project was the work of a lifetime's intimacy with JP's ideas and writings. In his later years, he conceptualized a full biography of JP, a work he could not complete due to his ill health. His daughter, Sujata Prasad, sitting here, took up the manuscript and gave it life. And thank you very much for the present of that volume to me as well. We are privileged also this morning to have with us members of Professor Prasad's remarkable family, whose own achievements have enriched India's public life. Ambassador Jayant Prasad, a former ambassador to Afghanistan and Nepal, who I've had the privilege of knowing over several decades, whose distinguished career perhaps marks the only instance in Indian diplomatic history, and Professor Ambassador TCA Raghavan can correct me, is the only instance in Indian diplomatic history where both father and son served as ambassadors to the same country. Sujata Prasad, who really helped to curate this event, civil servant, writer, biographer. Tripurari Sharan, is he here?
No.
He's an absentee son-in-law like many of us. Former Chief Secretary of Bihar, noted theatre personality and former director of the Film and Television Institute of India and a very dear friend of mine. Sanjay Prasad, Sangeeta Prasad, IAS officers, and all the other faculty members and distinguished people who are present here today. We are equally privileged to have as today's main lecture delivered by the formidable Ambassador TCA Raghavan, Honorary Professor at SIS, JNU, diplomat scholar whose career and writings exemplify the very spirit of our school. Ambassador Raghavan joined the Indian Foreign Service in 1982. His distinguished postings include service in Kuwait, UK, Bhutan, and as India's High Commissioner to Singapore. Most notably, he served as India's High Commissioner to Pakistan from 2013 to 2014, navigating one of the most sensitive and complex relationships in our diplomacy with great skill and balance. Ambassador Raghavan is also a historian of South Asia. He's an honorary professor, as I told you, at JNU, whose books have enriched both scholarship and public discourse. Among them, Attendant Lords, a study of Bayram Khan and Abdul Rahim Khane-Khana, which received the Muhammad Habib Prize, The People Next Door, a deeply insightful history of India-Pakistan relations, and History Men, on the work of historians who shaped our narratives. His writing is admired for its elegance, its grounding in archival research, and its ability to make history speak to contemporary realities. In many ways, Professor Raghavan represents the SIS ideal, the blending of rigorous scholarship with lived diplomatic experience and a commitment to fostering informed public debate. It's only fitting that he should be speaking today on a subject close to both his heart and Professor Bimal Prasad's enduring concerns, the elusiveness of South Asian cooperation. As we mark 70 years of the SIS, we are reminded that institutions endure because of people who shape them. Professor Bimal Prasad's life stands as a testament to the proposition that scholarship and service are not separate callings, but complementary ones. And in remembering him today, and in listening to Ambassador Raghavan's reflections later, we reaffirm our commitment to an SIS that remains true to its founding ideals, rigorous, relevant, and rooted in both India's civilizational and its global engagement. It's in that spirit that I once again welcome you all to a morning of tribute, remembrance, and learning. And may I now request our great guru, Professor Emeritus, Professor S.D. Muni, who spent many years as a colleague of Professor Bimal Prasad, to enlighten us with a few of his incisive remarks. Professor S.D. Muni.
वो कहता है फोटो यहाँ से ले he said that
नहीं पहले ले पर अब आप जहां भी जाएंगे कैमरा वहीं आएगा.
Hello, yeah. Well, I'm extremely thankful and grateful to the School of International Studies Dean Professor Amitabh Muttu and Professor Prasad family for giving me this opportunity to speak on the sanitary celebration for Professor Prasad. I feel privileged and honored to do this job. I may be having a million sweet memories of Professor Prasad, and obviously I cannot narrate them all in the 5 minutes allocated to me. So, what I shall do is to highlight three things which impressed me personally, and I'm sure it impressed all his colleagues and students to put it before you. Firstly, he was a father figure to us. Whenever we had any problem, we went to him, and he was more than willing to engage with that and resolve it in so many different ways. He was far beyond the academic classroom or discussions. He went and established very sweet rapport with the parents and grandparents of the students and faculty members. And I've experienced it whenever my maternal grandmother came here, he would go and chat with her for hours together. And she would miss many times that long time Professor Prasad has not come, so I'll tell him, and next day or next same evening he would be there. Now, this kind of a quality, sorry, I haven't come across any other colleague, any other friends. So he was a father figure to us, much more than if he felt that a student needed some support, even in employment, even in resolving personal problems, he was always there in the forefront. Secondly, he was an institution builder. South Asia before him was a small dot so far as ISIS is concerned. He made it into a center, a burgeoning center of Southeast Asian and Pacific studies. And this was not only limited to building the center. As a dean, I think he built the school and brought all the colleagues together. There were many who were uncomfortable with him for various reasons, but he was not uncomfortable with anyone. Knowing that somebody did not like him, somebody did not talk to him properly, he would smilingly go and engage with them and resolve whatever the kuntai were there. So this is how institutions are built. And later on, I think Rajendra Prasad Foundation, he was president or uh, I, that was so at different levels, not only in university. I think as a South Asia center, he he made it into a hub of SARC studies because SARC came at that time, and South Asian studies flourished for being a pioneer of the SARC studies, and I would say at least whole of India, if not the world. And thirdly, I think he was one of the most pleasant person one has come across. I've never seen him angry anywhere else. Very soft spoken, sometimes so soft that we could not even get what he's saying, and we would tell him, please, Professor Prasad, louder. And some of us who had an unnecessarily enlarged vocal cord, he would moderate us. Dhire boliye na. Now, this is something which comes out of affection and concern. And I think these are the three qualities which are extremely human, not necessarily limited to the profession that I still endure. And as I said, there are many other sweet memories. I'm sorry, I'll share it some other day. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Moon. I now have the great honor and pleasure of inviting Ambassador Professor TCA Raghavan to deliver the first Professor Bimal Prasad Centenary Lecture 2025. Ambassador Raghavan.
Thank you. Thank you. Professor Amitabh Mattu, Dean, School of International Studies, JNU, Professor S.D. Muni, Ambassador Jayan Prasad, Ms. Sujata Prasad, Shri Rajesh Khorat, ladies and gentlemen, I'm greatly honored and privileged to be delivering the Professor Bimal Prasad Centenary Lecture today. And to be quite frank, I find myself somewhat overwhelmed by this task. But may I begin by thanking you, Professor Mattu, and uh, Professor Bimal Prasad's family for giving me this great honor. And I feel truly privileged. I never had the good fortune of knowing Professor Bimal Prasad personally, in the sense I was never a student of his and also did not have the chance of working with him when he served as ambassador in Nepal. But I had met him on more than one occasion, as I will mention a little earlier. As was mentioned by Professor Mattu, Professor Bimal Prasad moved to the study of international affairs and foreign policy after early training as an historian and in spending several years as a teacher of history in the University of Patna. He was therefore a historian who moved to the Indian School of International Studies, then in Sapru House, and thereafter to SIS in JNU. But possibly this movement would have raised fewer eyebrows then than it would do today. At the helm of the ISIS, from its founding moment in Sapru House, had been another historian, Professor Appadurai. Those early years of the ISIS had seen a vibrant cross fertilization between disciplines, and that marked it out as a center and as a department of intellectual excellence. Professor Bimla Prasad's PhD thesis, as Professor Mattu mentioned, The Origins of Indian Foreign Policy, 1885-1947, straddles both disciplines and marks him out as a very early practitioner in India of the now very fertile field of diplomatic history. I had joined the Center for Historical Studies in the School of Social Sciences in JNU in 1976. And I have many clear memories of often encountering Professor Bimal Prasad in the offices of my then teachers, Doctors Bipin Chandra, S. Gopal, and especially Sabyasachi Bhattacharya. His presence there was very unusual. Even in a university that prided itself on its interdisciplinary approach, the School of Social Sciences and the School of International Studies were in those days, as I'm sure they are still, separate and sovereign territories. They had very little to do with each other. I now realize with much greater clarity than I did then that Professor Bimal Prasad was, in a real sense, a cultural crossover, a bridge between two disciplines, and someone who was conscious of the dangers of these two sovereignties in the form of the SIS, of the School of Social Sciences, and the SIS becoming self-contained echo chambers. The impressive and long bibliography of Dr. Bimal Prasad's published works reveals, to my reading at least, three principal interests. Firstly, a close interest in Jayaprakash Narayan, his politics, and his role as a link in the chain of intellectual evolution of modern India, beginning from Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru. A second area of focus was foreign policy and international affairs, and I will touch on this a little later in greater detail. But thirdly, the historian in him was never very far away in the many years he spent in the School of International Studies. His three-volume study of the partition of India remains very valuable reading today. Equally valuable is the volume of documents pertaining to the year 1945 in the Towards Freedom project of the ICHR, of which the general editor was my own PhD supervisor, Sabyasachi Bhattacharya. I used this volume to my immense benefit while writing my book, Circles of Freedom. I found that the range of documents which Professor Bimal Prasad had selected and included in this volume were intended to provide a granular understanding of how imperial retreats take place. In many ways, this volume is a selection of historical documents informed by a very strong foreign policy perspective, and I would really commend it to those who study modern diplomatic history today. South Asia and regional cooperation in South Asia had a special place in Dr. Bimal Prasad's interest and scholarship, as was mentioned by Professor Muni. I feel that there was a certain inevitability to this, given his earlier training as a historian of South Asia, and also given the fact that so much of contemporary South Asia, in terms of its geopolitics, has to do with how the region was constituted from the late 18th century under a colonial administration, and thereafter how multiple partitions impacted it in the 20th as the British Imperium declined and retreated. My remarks today on the challenges that confront regional cooperation in our immediate neighborhood will begin with a brief overview of how Dr. Bimal Prasad and his colleagues approached this very question 4 or 5 decades ago. Reading their writings from the late 70s and over the 1980s, one gets a sense of cautious but unmistakable optimism about the future of regional cooperation in South Asia. The traditionalist view that regionalism meant an opportunity for smaller countries to gang up against India was then weakening. There were, to my mind, perhaps two reasons for this. The first was domestic and political. The interregnum of the Janta government from 1977 to 1980, it was the first non Congress government in India's history since 1947, and this enabled a certain amount of fresh thinking both about the region and about Indian foreign policy in general. There was a seminar entitled Continuity and Change in Indian Foreign Policy in SIS in May 1978, and Professor Muni had analyzed the shift in thinking during the Janta interregnum, and I read that essay to my great advantage, because Professor Bimal Prasad had edited and published the proceedings of this seminar, including Dr. Muni's paper, in a volume entitled Indian Foreign Policy, which had appeared in 1979. In my reading, this volume remains a valuable marker in studying the evolution of diplomatic history in that period. The second reason was the second reason for this cautious optimism, I should say, was the emergent regional initiative of President Ziaur Rahman, the then president of Bangladesh, in 1980 on the establishment of a regional cooperation organization, which became a reality in 1985 with the coming into existence of SAARC. I find in Dr. Bimal Prasad's many essays and articles about this process, alongside this cautious optimism I referred to, also a clear appreciation of how tentative and hesitant this process was, especially in terms of Indian attitudes to it. Uh, he had thus noted in an essay in 1980, quote, South Asia has been quite late in waking up to the need for regional cooperation, unquote. There was simultaneously an appreciation of the headwinds that existed, and in particular, just how much India's neighbors were haunted by the specter of Indian hegemony. And he was to write at this time about, quote, the development of two diametrically opposite approaches to the problem of national security between India and its neighbors in South Asia. While the former, that means referring to India, while the former regards the entire region as forming its security parameter and wants the latter to collaborate with it in keeping the external powers out of the region's political and military affairs, the latter, which are the other neighbors, the latter welcome the presence of external powers because they see the principal threat to their security in India. Unquote. So uh, there was, I'm sorry, finally, there was no underestimation of the legacy issues that weighed on each bilateral relationship in South Asia, beginning, of course, with India Pakistan, but extending also to India Sri Lanka, India Nepal, India Bangladesh, and others. But there was, despite this clear eyed appreciation of all the negativities in South Asia, a sense of optimism in, in the late 1980s. A sense of optimism emerging from the fact that the early SARC summits, beginning with Dhaka in 1985, had been a great success. The fact that the third summit in Kathmandu witnessed the formal adoption of a SARC convention on the suppression of terrorism was a matter of particular gratification, but there are other examples. This positive sentiment seemed to suggest a new potential to South Asian regionalism. At a seminar held in the school in the SIS just before the first Dhaka summit in 1985, the Bangladeshi economist Rehman Sobhan spoke of the emergence of a strong and dynamic regional community in South Asia, and this would, quote, provide a basis for building up institutional linkages with the regional groupings to the east and west of South Asia. The Arab community and ASEAN are natural economic partners for South Asia. Similarly, on these lines, the brilliant Bhavani Sengupta had wondered, quote, could regionalism come to the rescue of the spending momentum of bilateralism? Unquote. He also answered this question, quote, theoretically, yes, but as far as India is concerned, there are considerable difficulties. His conclusion, therefore, was, quote, it is clear then that India's bilateral quest for good neighborliness can only have a limited ballast. To inject a greater jet into bilateralism, India's foreign policy has to be transported to the level of active regionalism. Unquote. It is perhaps not necessary to further dwell on this cautious optimism amidst a deep foreboding about the weight of legacy and other geopolitical hurdles. The reason why and how this cautious optimism faded amidst the domestic political and external geopolitical turmoil of the 1990s are all well known, so I will not go into that. I will instead fast forward to about 2 decades later and make a personal anecdotal digression to December 2004. I was then posted in Pakistan, and that was my first posting there. The political sociologist Ashish Nandi was in Islamabad to deliver the presiding address at the annual conference of a local think tank. The theme of the conference was South Asia and South Asian cooperation, and this is what Professor Nandi had also focused his remarks on. I should explain that this was again a time when the idea of regional cooperation in South Asia was on a high, perhaps its highest point ever. The traction and public support that the idea generated was palpable even in Islamabad. A very successful SARC summit had been hosted by Pakistan just about a year earlier in January 2004. India Pakistan relations were on a rare upward trajectory. Ideas such as SAFTA appeared to be within grasp as a tangible reality. And finally, for once, there was even the glimmer of a possibility that some kind of lateral thinking may prevail on Kashmir. Terms such as SARC solidarity, SARC spirit, and even a SARC identity were frequently employed in public discourse alongside the narrative of a South Asian identity. In brief, that time in 2004 was an unusual moment in South Asian history. To many, it appeared in the enthusiasm of the moment that what Bhabani Sengupta had prophesied and hoped for in the early 1980s of regionalism driving a stagnant and paralyzed bilateralism could finally happen. Yet, despite this upbeat atmosphere, Professor Nandi had begun his lecture on a somewhat pensive note. South Asia, he argued, and this is my recollection, South Asia, he argued, was the only region in the world where most of its states defined themselves negatively, i.e., they defined themselves in terms of what they are not. Pakistan, Nepal, Sri Lanka thus desperately not thus try desperately not to be India. Bangladesh has a double burden, not Pakistan and not India. To do so successfully, it begins by insisting that it is not West Bengal. In India, it was said till recently that India is not Pakistan. Now, some critics insist that India is becoming like Pakistan. This was 20 years ago, and this is the thrust of what one of the points which Professor Nandi made, so you can get the drift of his remarks. His point was a more general and a regional one. And this was that, quote, South Asia can be called a collective of reluctant states, unquote. Professor Nandi's skepticism and pessimism, however, derived from an even more fundamental drawback that he identified in the SARC process and in the official vision of SARC. This was, he said, an elite project with an almost, quote, paranoid fear of anything that might push the region towards a people's SARC, involving free exchange of news, books, information, ideas, literature, art, films, and above all, free circulation of free thinking human beings, unquote. In this perspective, SARC's problems begin with the fact that it is conceived or was conceived as an elite project rather than a people's project, and even the efforts to include in SARC agendas a popular element had a bureaucratic and stated bias which was self defeating. It is unnecessary to dwell further on this skepticism with respect to SARC, except to take note of it. But I will return to this point about elitist and statist projects later. If we fast forward now a further 2 decades to our own time, it is evident that the skeptical or pessimistic view has triumphed. South Asian regionalism is today in the grip of a comprehensive crisis of three separate dimensions. Now, crisis, of course, is not new in South Asia, but let me emphasize this. As we enter, as we are in the middle of the 2020s, it is of use to reflect on just how turbulent the past 5 years of this very decade have already been. A global pandemic, a war in Europe, and another in West Asia, whose consequences include a small genocide. Also, early in this decade, we saw something no one could have ever anticipated, a disputed presidential transition in the United States, with even a hint of the unthinkable of regime stability being in doubt. There was an even wider scenario change, with numerous indications that a new Cold War had set in with the maturing of the US China contestations. Simultaneously appeared over these past 4 or 5 years that the constituent parts of South Asia are particularly brittle, even fragile. And this is the first of the three crises which, in my view, we confront today. On our eastern flank, Myanmar witnessed an old fashioned military coup in 2021, which reversed a decade long transition to democracy and has marked the beginning of a civil war which has since eroded the country's basic stability as a state system. On the western flank in Afghanistan, there was an even more dramatic change as the Taliban swept away a US installed architecture in 2021. In 2022, our closest maritime neighbor on the south, Sri Lanka, saw civic action of an intensity which we have seldom seen in South Asia. Popular protests swept away the ruling administration in Colombo. The president fled to exile, and chaos appeared to engulf Sri Lanka's state system before the semblance of constitutional change could asserted itself and a new government came to power. 2 years later, in July August last year, we are in fact on the first anniversary of the monsoon revolution in Bangladesh. A similar popular insurrection led to the flight and exile of its president. Unlike in Sri Lanka, however, the new architecture in Bangladesh is a hybrid of constitutional and extra constitutional elements, and the country itself is delicately poised between these two directions. In this very period, from 2020 onwards, different crisis vectors have matured and collided in Pakistan. The term polycrisis was coined for another continent and for another context, but it obviously seemed to apply with particular resonance to Pakistan through this period with climate change events, extreme climate change events, economic meltdown, political polarization, civil military clashes, and a national security crisis. All of this has been part of the headlines between 20, uh, headlines about Pakistan from 2020 to 2024. The second dimension of the South Asian crisis comes from the fact that this is much more than the coincidental clustering of individual national crisis points. Each of these individual country crises has been accompanied by a sharp deterioration in principal bilateral relations. We have thus seen dramatic spikes in tension in Pakistan Afghanistan, Pakistan Iran, Bangladesh Myanmar, Bangladesh India, uh, between India and Pakistan, of course, for reasons which are need not be gone into, and also between Myanmar and India with the ending of the free with the suspension of the free movement regime and of the fencing of the border. The continuing crisis in Manipur, to some extent, is a symptom of the difficulties in the Myanmar India interface. Amidst all this, of course, India and China also entered into a long military standoff, which is now easing a little, but a phase of our history in which the border situation was stable has certainly come to an end. There is a third aspect of the current South Asian crisis, and this is a crisis of South Asian regionalism and a general retreat from the idea of regional cooperation. To put it somewhat bluntly, at no point in the past quarter century, perhaps even longer, has the narrative of regional cooperation been weaker than what it is today. And very clear examples of this come from SARC, which has not had a summit since 2015, and also BIMSTEC. And I don't wish to go into too much detail, but the situation in Myanmar and the internal situation uh, in in Bangladesh creates headwinds for BIMSTEC, which means that regionalism in South Asia is now tottering. The narrative around regional cooperation has weakened, and there is a vacuum emerging around that concept. A vacuum inevitably means that there is potential for others to step in to fill it. China, for instance, has set up a China South Asia Forum. It is still a low key process, but it has the germ of an idea or the germ of a template of a new model for cooperation in South Asia that excludes India. Uh, Let me now weave these thoughts into some concluding remarks. Two divergent, even opposing streams of thought have dominated the debate around foreign policy in the past 5 or 6 years. The first is that of emergence of India as a global player on account of the strength of its state system, its growing economic and technological capacities, its size, and its demography. Giving credence to this view is our role in the G20, in the Quad, in BRICS, and most of all in our capacity to adopt independent strategic postures with regard to different issues which are there in the world today. The second, and dare I say, minority view is that the first perspective is largely a chimera. Far from being in a geopolitical sweet spot, we are in the midst of an extremely difficult neighborhood and regional situation. An expanded international profile may cloak this reality, and to that extent, it encourages an illusion, even a delusion, making us overlook grave dangers and mounting challenges in our immediate vicinity. My purpose is not to go into this debate or to delve into the merits and demerits of either position in this binary. I put it forward to provide a context and a background as I share some thoughts on the neighborhood situation, beginning with the elementary proposition that we cannot graduate out of our neighborhood. If this is true, then our neighbors merit constant attention. Many of us realize that suggestions and advice to governments are very easily proffered, but implementing new ideas, howsoever good they may be, is easier said than done. We all also know how true wisdom dawns only after retirement. I cannot also say, in all honesty, that while in service, I was open to suggestions from the outside. The compulsions in the crafting of policy are numerous and not always evident to those not on the inside. And so I conclude my remarks today with some very tentative observations. Relations with immediate neighbors are at the heart of any country's foreign policy. They collectively comprise the sanctum sanctorum of any foreign office. It is undeniable that India's neighborhood is exceptionally challenging. Crafting policy is difficult and is often a thankless task of balancing foreign policy with domestic policy imperatives. There are no easy templates to follow. The situation in Bangladesh, as it has developed over the past few months, is an example. The vulnerability of the minority population there weighs very heavily on our conscience and therefore on our policy approaches. There is no easy way to craft policy in these circumstances. History offers few lessons, but we can sometimes extract from it certain pointers. One of these is the value of our own experience. Direct interventions with regard to beleaguered minorities in our neighborhood have rarely worked and have usually ended up as counterproductive. The example of Tamils in Sri Lanka in the 1980s or the Madhesis in Nepal in the last decade are examples. Diplomacy gives much better and more sustainable results. Pakistan is another obvious enough case. It will be difficult to evaluate which particular government over the past 75 years has had the most success in dealing with this most recalcitrant of our neighbors. The accumulated, the accumulated concentrate of our experience, however, points to a single policy takeaway. No matter how remote and distant the possibility of a normal relationship with Pakistan, this does not preclude the requirement of stabilizing relations with it to the extent possible. Stabilization means, in essence, a pragmatic approach of abjuring the perfect outcome and preferring the optimum. Equally important are the really big global issues confronting us, and the question arises on where India stands on these with respect to South Asia. Amongst these, the regional dimensions of climate change surely looms large. How India is to situate itself vis a vis this equation may well be a central question for its diplomacy in the future. It appears almost impossible to be an optimist with regard to South Asian regionalism today. Clearly, bilateral conflicts and disputes have prevailed over regional cooperation, both to our east and to our northwest. The internal dynamic over large parts of South Asia also militates against any revival of the spirit of regionalism. This weakening regional narrative gets further highlighted by a growing Chinese influence and presence in South Asia, which has introduced further strains and pressures to the already charged up South Asia cocktail. It is therefore, in my view at least, an unremittingly dismal picture. But can the failure of regionalism in South Asia or the elusive nature of South Asian cooperation also be attributed to the statist and elitist nature of the project, a point which I had raised earlier? It is of use to widen our lens and look further afield. not so much for guidance, but for redemptive comparison, with another equally elite and status project which has turned out to be remarkably successful. Diplomats from Southeast Asia do well to remind us that it was ASEAN that was the regional organization that was most destined to fail when it was set up in 1967. Southeast Asia then was in the crosshairs of the Cold War. The five founder members, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, Philippines, and Thailand, had profound differences, including major territorial disputes. Indochina was in the midst of foreign intervention and war and was not even on the ASEAN horizon. It is useful to recall that the 60s was the time when Southeast Asia was collectively termed the Balkans of the Orient. This was a phrase used to good effect by the geographer Charles Fisher. This was, he said, not because of the region's geographical fragmentation, but because of its deep cultural and political fault lines. War, genocide, foreign military interventions, secession, all this forms part of the history of Southeast Asia since the 1960s. A question we in India should therefore constantly pose to ourselves is why and how has regional cooperation in Southeast Asia through ASEAN been so successful, and why has it not been the case in South Asia? Both the regional institutions concerned were conceived as, and to a very great extent remain as, elitist and statist projects, but their outcomes and results have been quite different. So perhaps the answer lies in the nature of the elite response, and that is something which we have to focus on. This question poses itself much more centrally for India than for any of our neighbors, because in the end, we are the central force that defines South Asia. What was the role that Indonesia played in ASEAN's early and middle years, notwithstanding all its differences and disputes with Malaysia and others? Indonesia's preponderance in Southeast Asia matches that of India and South Asia. How was it so much more successful than India in discharging the vanguard role of establishing regional cooperation institutions in Southeast Asia? Perhaps the answers may reveal elements of a policy mix for us in India as well. But to get answers, first the question has to be posed. And I think there is a learning curve involved here. It may well be that the answer could be one we do not like, that the pace of regional cooperation has to be set by the most reluctant of our partners. But the policy prescription for us has to be to accept this rather than get frustrated by our incapacity or inability to set a faster pace for regional cooperation ourselves. There is one final thought with respect to neighborhoods that is compelling. Policymakers have the well known task of thinking ahead to situate where they would like the country to be at a certain point in the future. But there is alongside this a lesser known task. This sometimes carries an even greater burden. This is of thinking ahead to see where you don't want to be in the future. Two examples stand in today's world of trajectories which we certainly do not want for ourselves. The ongoing conflict in Ukraine is one, and the one in Gaza is another. There are numerous ways of analyzing both these conflicts. To me, however, both stand out as classic illustrations of just how badly things can go amongst neighbors if relations are not managed effectively. Avoiding such a future is also one of the imperatives that faces us today. It is as good a reason as any to confront the elusiveness of cooperation in South Asia frontally and directly, and then see what we must do about it. Finally, may I thank you again, Professor Mattu, for having invited me to deliver this lecture. And I feel, as I said, greatly privileged that I have been asked to deliver the Professor Bimal Prasad Memorial Centenary lecture today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Raghavan, for that outstanding, really overwhelming lecture with this great sweep of history and yet rooted in our region, as well as the concerns that defined Professor Bimal Prasad's life and work. Thank you for doing us this honor. Uh, a couple of things which we missed out on. I think we'll have the slideshow on Professor Bimal Prasad now, if you're ready to see that. And then we would like to symbolically honor Ambassador Raghavan as our speaker today.
Chandrasekhar. Kebila. There you are.
Muni sahab.
Yeah, Narayan. These were the South Asia masters. Urmila Fadnis, Kalin Bahadur.
Muni sahab is Thank you, and may I now give you a mug of the 70th year, symbolically.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And also something which JNU has crafted these days.
Oh. Thank you. Thank you.
We have a little, although this is a memorial lecture and we normally don't have a tradition of having a question and answer session, but then JNU breaks all rules. So we will allow for about 10 minutes of Q&A if Ambassador Raghavan
Yes,
would
yes,
agree.
yes.
So I'll just, if you can raise your hands, I'll try and, yes, sir, and if you could identify yourself also.
I'm Dr. Pandav.
Can you speak into the mic, sir?
I'm called Dr. Pandav. Because, hello.
Yeah, you can be heard, sir.
I'm Dr. Pandav from the All India Institute of Medical Sciences. I spent 45 years. I'm also called the Iodine Man of India. And the government gave me Padma Shri in 2021 for my work in this area. This work took me for the last 40 years in the South Asian countries, very intensely. My question to you, sir, very scholarly, and even a doctor could understand what you said. What is the role of United States, Russia, and China in terms of influencing South Asia policy?
Thank you. So we'll take 2 or 3 questions together, and then we'll ask Ambassador Professor Raghavan to respond. Would any faculty member from also the Faculty of South Asian Studies so dare to? Yeah, I noticed Professor Mandira Sharma, and of course, Professor Mandira, why didn't you speak in the phone? But I'll also invite members of the South Asian faculty, Rajesh, Sanjay Bhardwaj, and whoever else wants to say a few things or just ask a question. But first, Professor Mandira Sharma.
Thank you very much, sir. I really enjoyed your speech and it was really fascinating. My question to you is, what would be your prescription for making the SARC project more people-centric or more people-oriented vis-a-vis the elitist project that you had just now mentioned to us? Thank you.
Okay, Rajesh, you want to say something?
Yes.
Please.
Thank you very much, sir. So generally we discuss the decay of SARCA in the various critical perspectives, but then can we have any intellectual cooperation within the SARC countries? We can pursue further, academically at least. What are the opportunities?
Sanjay?
Yeah, thank you, sir. Thank you very much, sir, for organizing this wonderful, very, very insightful lecture and inviting Ambassador Raghavan. Very outstanding, sir. I really learned a lot while you were speaking on South Asia, regional cooperation, and all that. Thank you for delivering this lecture. Let me put in, while we are looking the regional cooperation, and when I was reading one book written by J.N. Dixit, and he categorically mentioned, like in 1980s, early 1980s, that India was reluctant to go for the regional cooperations. Like India perceived that all the neighbors, small neighbor, or all the neighbors of South Asia are trying to gang up against India for the regional cooperations that we were looking forward. So, and today what we found that we could not progress much. How do you find that really India is central? Of course, it is central while we are keeping all the aspects into considerations, geography, economy, dependencies, and all that. But do you feel that the other countries were also equally reluctant, or they were really looking to have a better cooperation in South Asian countries? Because as per my understanding, I understand like the role of Pakistan, and particularly terrorism and all that, they have been exporting and sponsoring terrorism and all that. I think what India maybe was reluctant in initial years, but Pakistan had been more reluctant to, because it serves its geostrategic interest. It served what the Americans wanted in South Asia. So I would like to know your views on that. Thank you very much, sir.
Dr. Sheetal, one final question. Yeah.
Thank you, sir, for that wonderful presentation. I just wanted. Sir, can we compare this to the model of European integration, if at all you perceive it to be a successful model of integration?
Okay. Ambassador.
Oh, thank you, and thank you for all these questions. I don't know whether I'm equipped to answer any or all of them, but I will give my views as Professor Panda asked about the role of great powers, and certainly there's always been a role of external powers, great powers in South Asia. I think, in my view, sometimes that role has been very direct, very interventionist, as we saw in the case of the US and the Soviet interventions in Afghanistan, and thereafter the US intervention in this century in Afghanistan again. At other times, it is a more subtle role. I mean, the case which comes very prominently to mind is that of Bangladesh. And, there is a view amongst many of my former colleagues that the US played a very direct role in what happened in Bangladesh last year in the course of the monsoon revolution. In my view, and this is my view, while great powers, US, Russia, China, have a certain role, I think we should not exaggerate that role. In the end, what happens depends a great deal on the agencies of the countries concerned. I think what happened in Bangladesh is a classic case that while they may have been great powers or external powers involved, but we cannot deny agency to the Bangladeshis themselves. The government made many significant and costly errors of judgment and mistakes. You cannot exclude that. I mean, if you look at what happened in Bangladesh in the last 7 8 years, internal in terms of internal developments, and you put the external intervention on the other, the internal developments make a very compelling case for explaining what happened during the the monsoon revolution. So I think one should avoid the temptation of blaming outsiders for everything. This is my answer in brief.
Can I one with the permission of GM? The assassination of Ziaur Rahman. He was initiating SARC, regional cooperation. I think somewhere the external powers were responsible and was blamed that they played very significant role in assassination of Ziaur Rahman. How do you also, because I'm looking that you are not finding that Americans were not, they are very much to not to be united in the South Asian countries.
No, I agree. I agree. I mean, there are certain background influences in terms of external interests, and we all other countries are always involved with what is happening. It's a fact of life that as the world has become more globalized, external interventions have become much more effective. But my point is that let's not jump to the conclusion and deny people in South Asia their own agency. I think when you see what the scale of what happened in Sri Lanka or the scale of what happened in Bangladesh, in sheer common sense tells you that an external lever cannot bring about this kind of change. It could contribute to it, maybe it played some role, but we have to grant agency to the main movers, which was the domestic situation in Bangladesh itself. This question about how to make SARC people centric. There are many ways of doing so, but in my view, the problem is not whether it is people centric or not, because regional cooperation, whether in Europe, whether in Southeast Asia, or elsewhere in the world, in the end has been a process driven by the state systems, not so much by people's actions. As an adjunct to interstate cooperation developing, as we saw in the case of Europe, this people's participation becomes important and also contributes further to that process. But I don't think we should underestimate the role of the role of the states or the role of the elites in driving this process. And the failure to do so means we have to question the nature of the elite response, as I said. Intellectual cooperation, Shri Khorat had asked the question. I think, intellectual cooperation today is much easier than it was even 20 years ago. I remember in Islamabad, when I first went there in 2003, the SARC agenda would have things like how to make newspapers, how to make films flow across borders. That has all been taken over, superseded by technology. With the internet, you don't need newspapers to physically move. You don't need a postal system. Similarly, with films, but there are other headwinds which intellectual cooperation confronts, and many of those are because of our own domestic compulsions, our own domestic politics. We have this excellent example before us of this film by Daljit Dosanjh. It's a hit all over the world. People are seeing it in Pakistan, but it's not been released in India because there is a Pakistani actress in it. And in the post-op Sindoor phase, there is a reluctance to show films with Pakistani actors or Pakistani actresses. Now, so there are those kind of constraints which confront intellectual cooperation within South Asian countries, and it's not easy to, single it out as an area where we can make progress without there being some kind of overall movement in other fields also. Uh, Professor Bhardwaj asked these very probing questions about how should India view South Asian cooperation and the role of Pakistan and terrorism. I think we have to be, we have to be very realistic about Pakistan. There was a India-Pakistan problem even before there was a terrorism issue. So so it's not just one factor. There is a fundamental difference of the way these two states have been constituted and the narratives which drive both the states. So it's not easy to say that one thing, if you resolve, will solve all the problems. No, it's a much more structural issue that is there. The question for India is, and especially if you look at the next 20 years, when I joined service, Ambassador Jayant Prasad will remember, at that time the lectures we would receive would be that in the course of your career, or very soon in the next 20 years, when you're entering the most senior parts of your service careers, India and Pakistan will complete 50 years as independent nations. And will the relationship remain the same? The question that confronts us now is that will we be shooting, like Cohen had asked 25 years ago, shooting for a century? So I think the question which we in India have to ask is that unless we address neighborhood issues, can we realize our other aspirations? I think that is really the central question. And it's not a question of sentiment. It's a very clinical assessment that we make, that can we realize our assessment in terms of our economies, the size of our population, all our global aspirations? Can we move towards realizing those aspirations if the state of our neighborhood remains as it is? If we feel that no, this is going to be a hurdle, then we have to address the neighborhood much more purposefully. It doesn't matter what Pakistan does or Bangladesh does, but we have to decide what is really in our interest. Dr. Sheetal had asked about the European model. I think yes, the European model has certain lessons for us, but I find the ASEAN case so much more compelling. Because it is the diversities in ASEAN in many ways, are far in excess of what we confront even in India. And I think that perhaps if you look at the marvel of Indonesia and look at Indonesia's achievements and probably see that as a template, both in terms of how it has survived as a nation, given those its enormous geographical fragmentation and the cultural and social diversity, and also how it has married its own national interests with the ASEAN project. I think we could possibly study that template to our advantage. Thank you.
Thank you again, Ambassador Raghavan. And before I invite Ambassador Jayant Prasad to deliver a formal vote of thanks, let me thank the family of Professor Bimal Prasad once again, especially Sujata Prasad, for helping us curate this event, and also all the others who have attending this lecture, including some people who have seen after a long time, including classmates of mine, Kishore, OP, and several others. And another doyen of South Asian Studies, Professor Urmila Fadnis's daughter, Aditi Fadnis, and we have a memorial lecture in her honor, which we shall be organizing shortly as well. So to all the friends of SIS and friends of Professor Bimal Prasad, friends of Ambassador Raghavan, not least the great friend, partner, and the woman behind Ambassador Raghavan's literary contributions, Ranjana Sengupta there. Thank you all for your presence, and I will now request Ambassador Jayan Prasad, who was an alumnus of the university, who I think, in my memory, has never stood second in his life. But on that note, may I request him to deliver a formal vote of thanks.
Thank you. Dean of the School of International Studies, Professor Mattu, Professor Emeritus. Professor Emeritus uh, Dr. S.T. Muni, Ambassador TCA Raghavan, distinguished faculty members, guests, members of my family, most of whom in my generation have been the alumni of JNU. Ladies and gentlemen, and I welcome and I'm very happy to see many old familiar faces here. It's my honor to propose the vote of thanks on the conclusion of the Professor Bimal Prasad Centenary Lecture delivered by Ambassador Raghavan. I would like to begin by thanking the Dean, Professor Mattu, Professor Muni, and Ambassador Raghavan for their remarks about my father. The SIS needs to be complimented for inviting Ambassador Raghavan to deliver today's lecture. We note that in his address, Ambassador Raghavan has rightly outlined the challenges in forging cooperation in South Asia and how all South Asians could gain from a deeper, wider, and more multifaceted relationship among the countries that inhabit a common civilizational space. Ambassador Raghavan has pointed to the legacy issues that come in the way of regional cooperation. In South Asia, these legacy issues went beyond geographical factors and include psychological ones. A trust deficit, connectivity gaps, and the absence of value chains have constrained South Asian mutual exchanges in more recent times. The imperative is to work together creatively on all aspects of connectivity, trade and investments, transportation, information and communications, know-how, and energy. And not the least, we have to find a way to address climate change issues together, to which no attention has been paid so far. All this will promote greater economic cooperation, deepen people-to-people contacts, and help in developing a habit of mutual cooperation. This is all the more needed in this moment of turmoil. I want to share a story about Ambassador Raghavan. He was my backstopper and my supervisor in New Delhi as the Joint Secretary for Afghanistan, Iran, and Pakistan in the Ministry of External Affairs when I was based in Kabul between 2008 and 2010. During a trip that we took together to Islamabad, I discovered that Ambassador Raghavan had completed his PhD at the same center where I too had studied. Asked him why he didn't add doctor before his name. It's such a great honor to do so. I remember what he said, and he's smiling. He said, I don't want to be made the head of archives in the ministry. I learned from him that you must dumb down in the bureaucracy. After he retired, he wrote many wonderful and well-received books, each of which show his wisdom and profound scholarship. And
mastery of nuance, which his lecture today demonstrates. It's my pleasant duty to thank Professors Mattu and Muni and express our sincere appreciation also to Professor Preeti Singh and the entire SIS team that put the program together. We are gratified by the presence of the JNU fraternity and the SIS fraternity in strength. Do accept our thanks to all of you for coming here this morning. It's been a pleasure to have you with us. Namaste and have a good day. And before leaving, we'd be happy if you joined us for a cup of tea.